All right, so welcome again, everybody. It's so great to see you. Welcome to the Penn State College of Medicine Navigating Primary Immunodeficiency Community Health Partner Echo Series. We're thrilled to bring you this very important series with our partners at the Immune Deficiency Foundation. As you know, my name is Melissa and I'm with the Project Echo team. Before I get to our regular announcements, let me ask my partner to introduce herself. Jessie?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jessie. I'm an education program coordinator with Project Echo at Penn State, and I'll be helping out with the attendance today.
Thank you very much. All right, on to our announcements. We ask that you do not share the Zoom link with anyone, but instead, if anyone that you know of would like to join us, please send the link to register or let me know and I'll be happy to do that. We do ask that during the session, you stay muted unless you're speaking to take care of some of that background noise. Closed captioning is enabled if you would like to use it. That's the CC icon on your Zoom screen. We also ask that if you're able, please turn your video on for the entire session, as we love to see your smiling faces. Please also remember that no protected health information is allowed when discussing your experiences with patients or clients. And today will include workplaces. We'll ask everyone to please discuss workplaces without using the name of a particular business. We are recording these sessions and they will be made available to you, as well as all materials used during the session. You just need to email me to request any recording of any past session, and you must be a registered participant. We also ask you to please respect the fact that no personal medical advice can be given during our session for you or your patient or client. Our partners at the Immune Deficiency Foundation have extensive and excellent resources and information on their website. That link is always included in the follow-up email that I send you. I'm also going to put it in the chat here, because if you haven't had a chance yet, I strongly encourage you to take a look at that site. I learn something new every time I go on it. In the spirit of Echo's all teach, all learn education model, we will all be on a first name only basis during our session. But most importantly, what that means is that everyone is here to learn, and that means participants and panelists alike. And again, I'm going to ask you to use the chat for questions or suggestions sparingly, so that with our large group, it doesn't explode and we're all able to focus on our live discussion. And finally, if you're logging in with a phone number or you have others joining you who are not logged in, please let Jessie know with a direct message so our attendance records will be accurate. Okay, we are going to begin today with our flash talk on working with PI, and that will be presented by our guest speaker, Chris Duckett. I'm going to ask him in just a moment to introduce himself. And following our talk, we have an experience and some challenges shared by our participant, Amanda Turkanian. Thank you so much, Amanda. I think this will be a wonderful discussion, and I hope you'll all participate in sharing some of your own experiences and challenges in the area of working with PI. Let's move on to some introductions of our panelist team, and we'll begin with Diana today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Diana, and I am the mother of a child with PI.
Thanks very much. Ken?
Good morning. My name is Ken Bass. I'm a patient with common variable immunodeficiency. Also serve with IDF as a Get Connected leader that provides group support for other people with PI in Texas.
Thank you so much. Paula?
Hi, I'm Paula now. I'm a physician that takes care of patients with immunodeficiency and Penn State allergy, asthma, and immunology.
Thanks so much. Alyssa?
Hi, everyone. My name is Alyssa Kramer. I'm the Senior Director of Education and Community Services at IDF, and I'm happy to be here with you all.
Thanks very much. Megan?
Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Messick, and I'm the Director of Education at the Immune Deficiency Foundation. We're so happy that you guys joined us today.
Absolutely. Thank you. Colleen?
Morning. I am Colleen Brock. I am the manager of medical programs at the Immune Deficiency Foundation. I am also a patient with PI, and we have 2 young adult children with PI. And I am also a registered nurse.
Thank you very much. And our guest speaker today, Chris, would you mind introducing yourself briefly for us?
Absolutely. And thank you. It's great to see everybody here. name is Chris Duckett. I'm the Director of Talent Management, and I also serve as the Volunteer Coordinator with the Immune Deficiency Foundation. And thank you for the invite. Happy to share some information today and looking forward to talking.
All right, and on that note, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get to your presentation. We get our introductory slides out of the way. There's our disclosure slide 1, disclosure slide 2. And then Ken, whenever you're ready, just let me know when to advance the slides.
Okay, so
Sorry, Chris. Yeah.
all right. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide, and I'll kind of jump in. So just a little bit of history, and I'll make this quick since I've already introduced myself. I've got a little over 20 years of experience in the human resources world. I've worked in the retail industry, but I've really sort of found my home working for medically based nonprofits. As I mentioned earlier, I have the privilege of serving as the Director of Talent Management for the Immune Deficiency Foundation. Have done a lot, unfortunately, in the space of navigating the employment world for people with disabilities and people with any sort of medical conditions, and have seen this from both sides, and which is why this is a topic that I really kind of get excited about presenting, is because I think there's a lot of information that's not known about some of the way the laws work. So I think it's great to share this from a perspective of the employer, but also as an employee, and how both sides should see this challenge that people go through. So that being said, if we can go to the next slide. Couple of things that I want to address today, and I understand that we do this pretty quickly, so I'll jump into these pretty high level, and then we can ask questions as we go. We're going to talk a little about the applicable federal laws, some common terms and philosophies related to working, with any sort of medical condition or chronic illness, what you should expect from your employer, and I think we're going to get into some more of that conversation as we get further into the presentations, and then we'll have some questions, some open conversations. So if we can get into the next slide, we'll dive into those applicable federal laws. Now, one thing I do like to point out before I dive into this is that I am not an attorney. So what I'm going to share about these laws is really just sort of what anybody can read on a website, but also a little bit of perspective from working through these as an employer and what things are there. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, this is something that has been around since 1990, and hopefully everybody's heard of this, and I don't think I'm going to share anything that you've not heard of before, but there may be some nuances to some of these laws people don't always know about, or for that matter, even some of your employers and people who represent employment don't always really understand fully either. So the Americans with Disabilities Act basically started out and said it prohibited discrimination in anything related to the job or the hiring process. So anything employment related to hiring, advancement, discharge, compensation, job training. It basically said that you can't discriminate against people with disabilities. But it also put some terms in place, some things like confirmed or perceived disability. So just because an employer can't discriminate, a lot of employers will not ask for clarification. So they just assume that because somebody, for example, walks with a limp, or there's maybe is missing a limb, that they qualify as being disabled. There's a lot of broad terminology that falls into these laws, which can cause confusion. But what it's also did for us is it introduced the requirement of employers making reasonable accommodations. So this all started with the Americans with Disabilities Act. This applies to employers with more than 15 employees. So any employer, even smaller employers, this may not apply to, but for the most part, just about every employer out there is going to fall under the Americans with Disabilities Act and the requirements of that, and especially the reasonable accommodations proponent of this, which we're going to talk in more detail about as we go. So next slide. And then what also then happened in 2008 is we got this Americans with Disabilities Act Amendments Act. So as often happens, we had the Americans with Disabilities Act, and there were some changes that were made that were launched into by the Amendments Act. Now, what this did is it provided some clarification to a lot of recurring questions under the Americans with Disabilities Act. One of the things it pointed out was the definition of what it means to have a disability. And this is where we get the very common thrown out definition now, which is limiting one or more major life activities of such an individual, or a record of such impairment, or being regarded as having such an impairment. So this center bullet here, a record of having such impairment, means that even if it's something that's historical that you've had a challenge with, it might still qualify you as being disabled under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But one of the things that I bring to this conversation specifically is it explicitly mentions major bodily functions, including the immune system, as an example of one or more major life activities. So basically, anybody who is living with PI is going to qualify as being protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I like to point that out just because we often hear, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, so to speak, that it's the invisible illness concept that you can walk in a room and people don't think that you're sick. They may not recognize that there's a challenge there. But I like to point this out because I want to make sure, according to the federal law, according to the Americans with Disabilities Act, it does qualify as a disability. So you fall under the protections of those acts. We're also going to talk a little bit later about how the Americans with Disabilities Act Amendments Act, in the idea of accommodations, how this interplays with some of the other laws which have always been seen as being sort of hard, set in stone sort of laws. So for example, if we move to the next slide, hopefully everybody here has heard of the Family Medical Leave Act. This applies to both a patient and caregiver. So what FMLA did is it defined the ability for people to have a unpaid leave protection to care for themselves or a family member. FMLA provides up to 12 weeks, 480 hours of unpaid leave for a serious health condition. There are further aspects of FMLA for things like military exigency, which is if somebody's getting deployed. There's a lot of protections there, but as far as the FMLA is concerned, as far as medical conditions, it applies to the employee or their direct family member. Now, one thing that I like to point out is that you're eligible after 1 year of employment. And this is one of those things that a lot of people don't fully get their head wrapped around, but it's 1 year of employment and after you've worked 1,250 hours. This applies to employers with more than 50 employees. So even though you may have work for a smaller company, this may not apply. A lot of companies have adopted FMLA policies, even though they may not necessarily fall directly under the actual FMLA rules. Now, there are states out there, and this is where I would say that we could get into this for hours, but there are states that have established even more robust leave that would say that, for example, you may be eligible for that after 6 weeks or 6 months of employment. So definitely encourage you to do a little bit of research on that if you're living in a state that might have that. So as we move into this, I also want to focus a little bit of time because we're going to get into this in more detail, I think, as we go, and this will be questions that people have. There's a thing under FMLA, we talk about up to 12 weeks of leave, and a lot of people would assume that that has to be a lump sum time off. FMLA can be taken in intervals, and those intervals are defined as the smallest amount of time that your organization tracks time. So if you're an organization that tracks the work done by the hour, FMLA can be taken in 1 hour blocks. You have a total of 480 hours to use in a 1 year period that can be taken in smaller intervals. So whereas a lot of people think, okay, I'm going to have surgery, I'm going to be off for 6 weeks, I'm covered under FMLA. An example you might kind of use is I could take theoretically under FMLA, I could take 5 hours per week of leave for recurring treatment. So if I have something that I have to go to and it's every Friday afternoon to have treatment, that would be an example of intermittent FMLA, and that's a protected absence if my company falls under the guidance of FMLA. It can be down to 1 hour a week, and there should be a way that your organization is tracking that time off. This is something, the whole idea of intermittent FMLA is something I think is very much not understood by folks. And I also think from an HR perspective is also often not understood by HR departments. And it's something that for people with PI is probably something that's a great protection that's needed and they need to be well aware of. So glad that we can bring this up, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we get into accommodations, how these things and accommodations under FMLA can be made to even change the rules. When I started in the HR world, that 12 weeks and 480 hours, basically, if you hit 481, the organization could part ways with you, basically could fire you. So that's changed. That's substantially changed with the Amendments Act. So we'll talk about that a little bit further about how accommodations can include tweaks to Family Medical Leave Act as well. So next slide, please. Common terms and philosophies that we run into, and I like to make sure I point these out in this discussion. The term of qualified person. when you talk about things and people being discriminated against for disability or being discriminated against for age, before you can be discriminated against, you first and foremost have to have been qualified for the job you're applying for, if you're applying for work. If you're not qualified, if the job requires that a person have a degree or a certain education, or there's a requirement that you have to be able to lift a certain amount of weight, these are parts of what's called essential functions. So you have to first and foremost be qualified. You'll often see the question asked in an application says, can you perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation? So you have to be qualified to do the job, and then the accommodation process can take place. Essential functions. These are the primary components, responsibilities, or duties of the position. They should be listed in the job description. So if you are applying for a job and you see a job description laid out in front of you, within that job description, there should be the essential functions. It's not going to be necessarily spelled out, but that's where if an employer, and I use lifting restrictions because it comes up a lot. If the job requires that you have to be able to lift 20 pounds without assistance, that should be spelled out in the job description. It should be a requirement. If the job requires that you be in person at a workplace, should be spelled out in the job description. If it's a remote organization, remote work, and you have to travel to the main office maybe twice a year, that should be spelled out as one of the essential functions of the position. These are the kind of things that we get into. Reasonable accommodations. This is a term that, again, gets thrown around. The term reasonable is very hard to define because it can vary based on the employer themselves. Reasonable means that it cannot cause your employer undue hardship. Reasonable can vary depending upon the request and the size and availability of the resources of the employer. So if the accommodation request is that I'm going to provide the employee a different type of computer system or a computer setup, well, if I'm a small company and that's going to cost a lot of money and I just don't have the money to do it, then that becomes an unreasonable request. So things to keep in mind. Then the other thing is equal, not better. This is sort of when making an accommodation, my accommodation is only required to provide equal opportunity for somebody with a disability. I do not have to treat them better than everybody else. So sometimes that's a little bit of a benchmark as we're talking about how the accommodation interactive process works. So for example, this comes up with remote work. If everybody in the position is required to go into the office for the job, but somebody says, well, I don't want to have to go into work, I want to be able to work from home, that could be a bit of a challenge because that could be seen as I'm treating that person better than everybody else because I'm taking away a requirement of the position to be in person. Now, I'm going to say this very clearly that with COVID and the amount of work from home that was done during COVID, the idea of not making an accommodation for remote work becomes more and more challenging for employers, especially if just 6 months ago, everybody was working remotely and now all of a sudden we're in person again. I think it'd be very hard for an employer to not want to at least consider that accommodation request of working remote. So that becomes a sticking point and probably something, again, that we could talk about for hours. So, okay, next slide. So employer interactions. Every employer, when it comes to accommodation, should have a clearly defined process for requesting an accommodation. So I would say if you're unsure about how you go about doing that, I would check with your HR department. But that being said, I like to point out that accommodations are to be requested and then approved or denied. That means that an employer is not going to assume that an accommodation should be given if they're not asked for that accommodation. In fact, it can be a bit of a challenge in the litigious society that we live in for employers to assume that accommodation should be made, because you're also assuming, the disability, you're also assuming a lot about that situation. So what I would request, or even not request, but I would recommend to individuals, if you are in a position where you think you are going to need to request an accommodation, I would start with your physician. Take the job description to your physician. Your employer is going to have the right to inquire about conditions if you are requesting an accommodation. So start by taking the job to your physician, have a conversation with your physician about what you think you would need, because ultimately the employer is going to ask for your physician to provide some sort of a notice or some sort of restriction letter that's going to help with the interactive process of applying for an accommodation. So start with that. Make sure that you understand your ability to perform the essential functions of the job, and the employer should only disclose any information as it's needed to consider accommodations. It shouldn't be a situation where you get a letter from your physician, the employer then announces to the entire organization, hey, this person has this condition, and that's why we're making these accommodations. It's private, it's confidential, but they do have the right to inquire. They do have the right to ask about those things as it applies to the accommodation request. Okay, so if we can get into the next slide. The interactive process. The interactive process is something that's laid out between the ADA. It's also mentioned in the EOC. This sets an expectation that both the employee and the employer will negotiate in good faith to reach an agreeable outcome as it applies to requesting an accommodation. So as I mentioned earlier, an accommodation should be requested, and then the employer either says yes or no to that accommodation. But if the employer is saying no to the accommodation, the ADA EEOC is going to expect that the employer is going to negotiate in good faith and say, well, we can't do what you're asking, but we might be able to do this instead. And that's why they call it interactive process. We can go back and forth on this conversation multiple times, but the idea is to try to reach an agreeable outcome so that a person can maintain their employment, or for that matter, be considered for a position. I mentioned earlier that we'll talk about documentation. I'm going to sound like a broken record as we get into this, but I'm going to tell you over and over again, document everything. From an employer's perspective, we're going to document everything. From an employee perspective, document everything. Just because of the fact that these are things that are often end in litigation, unfortunately, and so you want to make sure you have any requests, you have copies of those things you've made, anything from your employer that they've given you, document, keep copies of it, ask for copies of these things. They only help down the road. The idea is we want to always negotiate in good faith, but that being said, if everything can't be reached, or if there is something that is going to go south, it's good to have your ducks in a row and have all the documentation you can. Okay, next slide. Okay, open discussion and some questions here. So this is something that I often get asked is, what do I need to disclose about my condition or my illness, either when I'm applying for a position or if I'm already working somewhere and I need to have an accommodation? So the answer to that is really nothing. If you look at a job description and the job says I'm working from remote, it says I've got flexible time. If it says here are the requirements of the position, and you meet all of those and it will work for you, there's no reason you have to disclose that you have a chronic illness or something that's going to get in the way. If you can do your treatments outside of work hours, if there's no accommodation that's needed, there's really nothing that has to be brought up. When do you disclose it? Well, you disclose it at such time as you think that there's an accommodation needed. Now, there are countless examples. I've actually talking to our volunteers and I've asked a few people different questions. What I've found is that there are times when in the middle of the interview process, the question comes up or something gets brought up about a requirement of the position, and they find out or discover that at that point in time that maybe there's a bit of a challenge there and accommodation might be needed to be considered for the job. That's when you would disclose that. But I would recommend that you disclose that with a little bit of a nugget towards, here's how we get through it. I talked about that negotiating in good faith. Make sure you come at that with the idea that you want to be productive. You want to be as flexible as you possibly can be. What always puts employers on edge is when people come with demands. And very early in that process, if you're applying for the job and that application comes with, I need to have this day off, always this time, I need to make sure that our benefits cover the following things. Those are great questions to ask, but you have to make sure that you're not coming across in a way that's demanding of the employer changing things about the position. It's got to come up with, I can do all the things that you want me to do, but I might also need this, and it's more of an ask. It just keeps things kind of on the level and in good standing between both parties. Okay, so once hired, are there any tips for requesting accommodations? I mentioned before, ask, don't demand. Demanding feels litigious and it puts everybody on edge and puts their guard up. What we're looking for there is the interactive process is supposed to be a good faith and friendly interaction. And I think you'd find that if anybody, as we go into that, that's what we're after. So the key takeaways here, prior to applying for position, approaching your current position, definitely discuss any work-related restriction you might have so you know going in before you apply for positions, whether it's something you can do. Make sure you understand how your specific illness will impact the ability to perform the essential functions. Make sure you inquire and follow the process for requesting an accommodation. Negotiate in good faith, as I mentioned. And remember, I said document one more time. Maintain all documentation of all interactions. So I think that's where I drop off, but lots to cover, lots of information. There's references and resources here. I'm going to point out the bottom two. There are pages and pages and pages about FMLA, and specifically the intermittent FMLA. Those are great resources, and these are right off the Department of Labor website. So definitely recommend reviewing those. If you've never seen those before, it's worth a read.
All right, thank you so much, Chris, for all of that information. Before we move on to Amanda and her experience, does anyone have any specific questions for Chris? Colleen.
Colleen's throwing it out. Okay, go ahead, Colleen.
It's always me. And you may or may not be able to answer this, but I'm curious, do you think the HR departments have noticed a difference in accommodation requests, the amount of accommodation requests, and their understanding of accommodation requests before COVID versus after COVID?
So I think there was definitely a spike in accommodation requests going into COVID. I think there was a lot of things that came out that were a little different than what HR departments were used to dealing with. So specifically, we probably all know that a lot of employers went to vaccine requirements, and depending upon your individual circumstance, that may not have worked for you. There may have been situations where people were asking for an accommodation to not have to receive a vaccine. You could be talking about work from home requirements where people went remote, but then other folks said, well, I'm going to stay remote, as opposed to. So I do think it got better. I also think that the HR departments have become more versed in this as they've gone on. And I also think that a lot of employers, that idea of having a defined process for a request for an accommodation, I do believe a lot of HR departments sort of got caught off guard on not having one of those. And so you'll probably see more and more departments have those well defined.
Great, thank you. Good question, Colleen. Anybody else? I think questions may come up once we get to Amanda's experience as well.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to move on just for the sake of time to Amanda, and we'll go through that experience. She has some challenges, and we have some questions at the end of that for discussion. So hopefully we'll get you all involved in the discussion then. Amanda, I'm going to go ahead and share. So whenever you're ready, take it on.
All right. Well, my name is Amanda, and I am a patient, a caregiver, and I am employed full-time. I worked while seeking a diagnosis for my symptoms. I had no answers for years before I was finally diagnosed. During the time prior to my diagnosis, I was supported by my employer and my coworkers, which I know is not the case for everyone. Since my diagnosis, I have become a single mother to 3 children. My coworkers are awesome. They're there when I get sick. They make me meals. They'll help run errands for me. They help me a lot whenever I face a crisis when I'm sick.
Sorry, my mouse is not cooperating. 1 second. Go.
Some challenges that I faced is I had to change departments due to the physical challenges of fitness instruction when I was going through the diagnostic process, and when I was diagnosed, I did have to change what I do. Other departments that I was moved to required more contact with children and also with germs, so I became sick more often than I previously had been. Some of my previous supervisors did not know how to ask about my condition or offer intermittent FMLA. I actually had my diagnosis for over 2 years before I learned about intermittent FMLA, and COVID really complicated this time period as well. I've had to train and work with all my supervisors and upper level management on FMLA, and communicating everything takes a lot of time. Every time I switch departments, I have to train everybody on what our policy is, what I've been asked to follow. And that can be really hard at times. And it's intimidating, I guess, to me. There is also the notion, because I look healthy and I take really good care of myself, that I'm not sick. I think people really don't understand. I always come to work dressed up. I exercise. I do incredible work where I am. But it's a struggle. And a lot of times I look completely normal, but I might have pain from an infusion the night before, or it may just be harder on me because I have 3 kids and I'm trying to do everything. And I always try and present myself well, but the flip side of that is people often don't realize how sick I actually am. They don't take it seriously until I really tell them how much it costs to treat me every week. And then that usually clues people in. So that's really one of the more challenging things that I face is I just look like a healthy person. So it can be very hard to get people to take things seriously. Do you want me to read the question slide?
Go ahead. Thank
Okay, so some questions that we came up with are, how can you help PI patients encourage their own workplaces to be supportive of invisible illnesses? What are some of the challenges patients and caregivers face when employers do not understand PI? How important are coworkers in creating a safe workplace where everyone is included and supported, even if employers are not supported? What are the most important types of support needed for PI patients and caregivers at work?
Okay, thank you so much, Amanda. I'm going to stop sharing, but I can put those questions back up. So what questions do you have for Amanda on her experiences, or what thoughts do you have on some of those questions that she had for all people suffering from PI? She hit some really good, interesting questions, I think. Participants, what do you think? Has anyone had to change jobs? One of the things I noticed on Amanda's experience is that she became unable to do certain types of jobs for certain departments, maybe had to switch. So if that's available to you, that's great. But what do you do if it's not? Because I see your hand and I am going to get to you. I'm sorry, we try and get participants to share their thoughts first, but I will get to our panelists. I can see some of them. I'm getting to know your faces when you want to talk. So participants, what do you think? Has that ever happened to you? Do you have any suggestions for what patients might do at their workplace?
I think that one of the most important things also is to know protocols.
Yeah.
When you move to a different job or institution. So while you're aware of those, I think you will like follow those protocols and it will help you definitely. I think that would be the main thing.
Yeah. Thank you, Monica. I think we heard that in Chris's talk as well. Sometimes they're easier to find, I think, than others. But yeah, that's a great suggestion. Know what they are and where to find them. Go ahead, Megan.
I think it's also important to understand the employer's culture and the environment in which you're working, whether it be the team environment, the management or supervisor leadership environment. That is really important to understand. And you may not know that through an interview process for a new employer. It's very tough to get, I mean, that information sometimes, that culture, like that's kind of like the secret sauce of like why teams work well. And you want to find out if that organization has the sauce that you want to work in. Or find the right team within an employer who is supportive and understanding. I think that's important to consider.
Great. That's a great point. You really don't know what it's like until you're already hired. And by then you're kind of stuck. So that's an excellent point. What about the idea of invisible illness? I think that's, Amanda pointed out that you don't look sick necessarily. So how do you explain to coworkers who might be very supportive, but kind of need to know what's happening first? John, go ahead.
Well, I would want to say in that regard that invisible illness is a much more common used term than just within the PI community today. And, many disease groups that have some neurological component or psychological component, and to be aware that, to have the courage and the awareness that your invisible disease is probably surrounded by people who may have had to have these conversations about other invisible diseases. And I do think, to go on Chris's comment, between COVID and the increase of understanding around invisible disease, I think we have a better opportunity for people to talk to their employers than they ever have. There's a better understanding. But as he said, don't forget to take your notes and document and follow the rules as Monica, and learn what the rules are.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that, Don. That's an excellent point.
And I think that following what Dr. Seymour says and Megan is like the simple fact when you get the time to know the department that you are, also is going to give you the facility to share also. You know how you feel, what is your, you know, health issues. So at the moment that you know that culture that what Megan was saying, so it's going to give you the opportunity to open up. And that way you can seek the help that you need. And also, like I said before, knowing the protocols is gonna certainly help you to, I said like, get better help if you need it at the time that you need it.
Yeah, exactly. Great point. If you don't explain it, people just don't know. It's hard to explain, I would imagine, especially if you don't know someone all that well. Paula, I see you unmuted, and I had a question for you. I was curious when Chris talked about talking to your doctor with a job description and bringing that in. I was curious what your thoughts would be from a physician standpoint.
That's a tough one, and it really will depend on the physician. I think like you know, I will be honest, most of us physicians, especially in primary immunodeficiency, are a little bit unfamiliar with all of the FMLA paperwork. So may like be on to you and trying to like get some of that information and doing your homework. I would say like kind of thinking back in terms of like when you're asking someone a favor, and not that this would necessarily fall into a favor, but trying to make it as easy as possible, like write everything down, getting all of the information, that's a way to advocate for yourself. What tends to happen very frequently with patients is, you know, I just get, hey, like fill all this stuff out or figure this out for me. And it really, if you would encourage, I know how much time you're already spending on this, but the best person that knows your illness and the best person that knows this ends up being you. So this is where you have to take some empowerment and try to help the people that can help you along. So the more that you can, instead of like giving so much to the physician or to the nurse practitioner or whatever, taking a big part of it, ownership yourself, simplifying the process as much as possible. And then people will be eager to help you as opposed to, hey, just figure this out for me. And then it's just like, oh, absolutely overwhelming. And it'll never get done in the way that it should for your employer, because each employer is a little different. I love the presentation. So thank you for sharing all of that with us. Just wanted to comment on that because it's just really powerful, and it does speak to all of the hard work like you've put in terms of really like taking control of your condition, but making it invisible is both a virtue and a challenge in itself. I'll just say, like I have, for instance, a very close physician friend with inflammatory bowel disease and other conditions where, you know, because she's successful and has, just like you described, you do everything and you're able to even take care of others, her pain and her condition is very undermined. So it's impossible to feel like, oh my God, work keeps piling things onto me because I look healthy, and they don't realize how much I'm struggling underneath. And so that just speaks to, hey, this happens to everybody, even physicians, that, you know, we should be able to know better, but we don't. So this is something where it's really quite a challenge. We're expected somehow in society to be superhuman all the time. It is hard to both open up to the employer or to colleagues. And at the same time, you might be a really private person and don't want to share things. So that's a really hard challenge. And how do you navigate that? Happens with mental health too, right? Like, how do you let colleagues know, hey, I have bipolar disorder, I'm working on it, without being judged or criticized. So a very challenging, tough line to balance. No simple solution there.
Right.
But thanks for sharing all that.
Thank you. And Chris, what did you want to say?
No, I wanted to comment on Paula's point of, from a physician's perspective. You're right. I have seen that where people take this entire mountain of paperwork and drop it on their doctor's desk and say they'll get it to you whenever they're done filling it out. That's a horrible spot to put your physician in, because you don't always know what exactly is involved in the position. And speaking from, I told you I've seen this from the employer's perspective, from the patient's perspective. While I do not have PI, I had bicuspid aortic valve, and I had that replaced. So I had open heart surgery, but I did exactly this. I took my job description into my cardiologist and I put it on the desk and we talked about it. And I said, look, I don't want you to pencil whip a 10-pound lifting restriction on me because you cracked my chest open. Let's talk about what I really can and cannot do. So when I go back to my employer, I can literally tell them, yes, I can go back to work in 21 days. I don't need 2 months off, because this is how we're going to get there. But that's the difference, is we actually have to take that to your physician and have a conversation. You can't just drop it on their desk and walk away, right? So I think that's great advice to say, just don't just flip it over. You've got to actually have some conversation about what you can and can't do and know what's involved in your position. So.
Gotcha. Thanks very much to both of you for those comments. I want to read something in the chat from Dana, unless you'd like to unmute, Dana. Okay, I'll just read it. It came to me as a direct message, so you all wouldn't be able to see it, but she makes a good point. Disability IN, which I will send you a link to, I'll look up, is a national organization focused on employment and the disability community, suggests not using the term invisible illness, but rather to use non-apparent disability because you are not invisible. I had not come across that before, but that's, oh, there it is. There's the link. Awesome. Thank you. Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, I just wanted to affirm when Chris was talking about the FMLA, and he said that if you're an employer with 50 or more employees, that you have certain restrictions. That's what I've found as far as, larger groups have a lot of good things in place telling you what their expectations are, whereas smaller ones don't. And I support what he said too about, you've got to go in and read some of these documents so that you can show an employer this is what they say, and this is what I would be requesting. I liked what Amanda said too, just about sometimes the closest workers you have, making sure that they understand what's going on can be the most support to you, because rarely does it come down from the top as much as the people around you. So I really appreciated when she shared that some of the people closest to her were the ones helping her the most.
Absolutely. I was thinking that too, that your immediate coworkers really can provide such a wonderful support if they're aware of what's happening or what your needs are. Any other questions or suggestions from participants or panelists about some of the other challenges working with, I'm going to get the comment right, the term non-apparent disability? What do you do if you're at a small firm? I know, Chris, you mentioned that they have numbers, and a lot of larger places, as Ken pointed out, do have things already in place. But what do you do if you work in just a really small business or organization? Do you have any source of resources if you need an accommodation?
I would first go to your state laws, because obviously anything I've shared today is a federal law, so it's going to apply across the board. But there are states that have actually implemented FMLA-like policies for smaller organizations. So you can dive into that. The tough part about why these things don't often apply to smaller organizations is because if you think about what FMLA does, FMLA provides, again, 12 weeks off. An organization of 10 people, that may become very, very challenging to have a vacant position for that long of a period of time. So there can be challenges with those smaller organizations, but there are still organizations that do provide leaves of absence. It's something that they do try to do. So that can also be something that you look at is, does the organization actually have a leave of absence policy that maybe it's not something that they shout from the rooftops, but there's some history that they've done that before, and that would still then apply to your own specific situation.
Good idea. So with the documentation in a smaller organization, would you advise it's more of a conversation that you need to have?
Yes.
Great.
Right.
Any questions for Chris, or thoughts or suggestions for others working in all different types of organizations and businesses? Diana, go ahead. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, coming from the caregiver's perspective, that Chris's, information on this came a little late for me. But being that, I started out when my son got sick, I went to PRN status, which is, not full-time, not part-time. I was trying to mesh my schedule in, and he got sicker and sicker and hospital stays. But as a PRN employee, which was this was a big facility, thousands of employees, I was only allowed one sick day a year, and then I was on write-ups. That being said, I wish somebody, or when I had that discussion from going full-time to PRN, said, hey, make sure you're getting your 1,200 hours so you could have an FMLA, if you needed it. And at that time it was, I went from full-time to PRN so I could mesh that schedule however I needed to for his care. And in so it burned my bridge for the FMLA, which it is what it is. But that's what's so important, and what I, try to get across to other parents that might be going through it, because we went from, a 2-income house to my husband's income to me just working when I could. And then eventually when I started, when he got hospitalized the second time, I took 2 days off for him being in the hospital. And then I was always on a write-up, and I understand that's how big corporations are. It didn't matter if I had a doctor's note, but it would have been, as the caregiver's perspective on this, making sure that those laws, which I didn't think applied to me because I didn't have a disability and he didn't have a diagnosis yet, but knowing that something was not right, it would have protected me to know ahead of time, and would have been just important to know.
That's
of these options.
Amanda mentioned intermittent FMLA, and I had never heard of it. And you make a great point about caretakers. What do you do if you're the caretaker, not the patient? And also, what do you do if the person you're taking care of doesn't have a diagnosis? So, of course, Chris, you're going to answer all of this for you.
I'll tell you, I am squirming in my seat right now because of this story. It's just it's killing me. So, from an employer's perspective, if you are an FMLA qualified employer, at the first note or hint that somebody mentions something that may be FMLA qualifying, we are supposed to notify you of your rights under FMLA. This is also something that should be in the handbook. It should also be posted in an employer's break room if they're an FMLA required event. So the fact is, if you had to go to somebody and say, I may need to reduce my hours because of this, then there should have been immediately a conversation, even if it's just a piece of paper they slide across the desk and say, these are your rights under FMLA. That's something that HR professionals are supposed to do. So Now, that being said, I apologize on behalf of whoever I need to, that didn't happen for you. Because that now, again, assuming you're working for an organization that's FMLA qualifying, that they're more than 50 employees, and that you've been there for at least a year, and that you've worked 1,250 hours within up to that year, that is something that should have occurred. That should have been.
Oh yeah, I was there for 12 years.
Yeah.
It was, I would say on both ends, I didn't know that was something that was available. I knew it was available because of maternity leaves and such, but I didn't know about that the hours requirement. I knew he was sick and I knew I had to take care of him, and I knew I was not going to be able to hold down a full-time job, but also I wish I was like, hey, maybe you would stay part-time and keep those hours so that, FMLA could be, something there, even when he did get his diagnosis. But it's just, that's just the caution for the caretakers of being aware. And that's why I really enjoyed your, your information, because I don't think, many people don't know that these are available and at what point to start planning for it.
Right. If I can, again, please, anybody who has these questions, please go to those links and read up on FMLA, because there are a lot of nuances to that people don't understand. And even the 1,250 hours we're talking about, it calculates backwards. You have to work 1,250 hours up to that point. Once that point starts, you don't necessarily have to hit 1,250 hours going forward, because you might be on leave during that time. So there's actually a way that's supposed to be calculated. And there's a way so yes, in those links, it's all Department of Labor's right off the Department of Labor website. If you have any questions about that, please go look, because you get it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, of the way that law is supposed to happen. Definitely would encourage everyone to go out there and read it. And it's not super exciting stuff. I get that. It's HR and it's laws, but that being said, I think it's often misinterpreted and misunderstood. So.
Well, Amanda, I think you said, even though you worked for a very supportive organization, you had to inform your employers about the intermittent FMLA, that they weren't aware either, right? So
my old manager, I see her a lot. She actually apologized to me a couple of weeks ago, because they were afraid to ask. Like, they were afraid to ask exactly what it was. And they just didn't know. And she still feels bad, because as a, newly single mom with their dad is in the military, I'm really on my own. And I rely really the people around me and the people at work. That's what I rely on. And everybody knew what I was going through. And it was draining, the worry that every time I was out, I was going to lose my job, because my job was my passion. It's what keeps me going. These people around me, like, I couldn't fathom what would happen if I got sick. For what eventually happened was I was sick for three weeks. It was a domino effect. I had it, then my boys were both sick, and I was the only person that could take care of them. And that's when finally I did my research. We had a new HR department developed, and those people knew. But even with that, I was still in subsequent meetings with write-ups, with people trying to tell me that, blame me for things that happened when I was on FMLA, and getting the ADA Act confused with intermittent FMLA, and saying the reasonable accommodations, that they couldn't reasonably accommodate my FMLA. And I said, nope, you've got it confused. And it's still a little uncomfortable for me at times to be around those people, because I had to shift out of that department, because it was just, honestly, it was just too uncomfortable for me, the struggle, and knowing how hard I work and how much I care about my workplace. It's, I had to keep an open mind. And then when I got moved again, I went through the same process. I still had to say, look, I'm not going to work on FMLA. That's not how this works. And really sit down and explain the nuts and bolts, especially when I have to take caregiver leave. I'm all my kids have. I can't handle client calls and employee calls and staffing matters when I'm trying to make sure they can breathe. Like that doesn't add up. But yeah, this has been very helpful, and I'm glad that I could share. But yeah, it did take a long time before I got the support that I needed.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. Colleen, I do see you. I'm going to get to Colleen because we're running out of time. But Chris, you mentioned documenting and you need to bring it up when you need the accommodation, but the onus is on who? It sounds like Amanda had to go to HR, and should HR not be the one telling her how this works?
So it's interesting if the accommodation is, well, the HR department's not expected to guess, right? So if Amanda's working her job day in and day out, never mentions anything, never says anything to anybody, she just does her job, and she's quietly struggling along and doesn't say anything to anybody, the HR department can't just guess that she needs help. Now, when Amanda comes and says, hey, I need this week off because my son is sick, or in whatever the situation is, and we say, okay, all right, now maybe the next time it's, hey, I got to take this week off because my son is sick, and now all of a sudden you're starting to see a pattern. There's a certain level of responsibility for the HR department to say, do you understand FMLA? Do you understand how intermittent FMLA works? This is where you start to notify people of their rights under FMLA. And then again, Amanda, you mentioned military. There's even parts of the FMLA that applies for people who are family of military that even extends FMLA to a bigger benefit. There's all kinds of nuances here to this situation that could be completely different had it been investigated or looked into earlier. So yeah, it's interesting. FMLA is one of those things that most people don't understand, but yeah, there's a lot of moving parts to it. And what I've always been taught, and I got this out of a seminar I went to with a law firm in Atlanta when I lived in Atlanta, I was working there, was basically at the very first hint of any sort of thing that would be qualifying under FMLA, that we are supposed to notify our employees of their rights under FMLA, even if nothing happens. So I tell you, here's what it is, and let's just use Amanda's example. Amanda says, well, yeah, I understand that, but I don't need it. Okay, then at least you know of your rights, and at least I've protected and covered myself as a business representative, that I've done what I need to do. Now, if Amanda comes back and says I do need to leave, then there's an FMLA request form, and there's things like that come after that. But yeah, so now again, that perceived disability, if somebody comes walking in one day limping as an HR department, it's a fine line between saying I'm going to go ask about that versus, the person, again, accommodations are supposed to be asked for, and then we have that conversation. So
okay, great to know.
It's clear as mud, but FMLA is something I'm personally passionate about. I don't know why, it's always struck in a chord for me in the HR world. So get pretty excited about that being done right.
Excellent. Good point. Colleen, last word. Go for it.
I was just going to say that it's not always FMLA either. So in my situation, I was the head nurse for one of my kids' pediatricians. There were two pediatricians. And when he became so sick and was in and out of the hospital, I became unreliable. So I went to the employer and said, I think I need to quit, and here's why. And in turn, we had a discussion about, I don't want you to leave. Could you do this? And so we went back and forth with an accommodation and came up with basically an amazing job where I worked when I could. So if Adam wasn't in the hospital, I was scheduled 3 days a week. If he was in the hospital, it didn't matter because I was sort of just the helper in the office because I could do anything and everything. So it's not always you have to ask for FMLA. Sometimes you can ask for accommodations during a time period, or even in my case, which was going to be a permanent thing, we came up with a great way that I could continue to work, but be there when my child was sick.
Perfect. All right, we have to end there. I'm afraid it's 1 o'clock. Thank you so much, Amanda, for bringing up that experience. I think it's been so helpful. And thank you, Chris, for all that wonderful information you've given us. We will send everybody the summary of those recommendations tomorrow. And please join us in 1 week, December 4th. We're not skipping 2. I'll send you a reminder, but December 4th in 1 week, we hope to see you all back for, I'm sad to say, our final session. And our topic is going to be living your best life with PI. So you are all our experts on that. I hope to see you next Monday. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Take care and have a wonderful rest of your day.